pick up where we left off, and we're going to do some lecture material today on arthropods. I'm going to cut this up into a couple of shorter videos, and so there won't be one long lecture, but there will be a couple of shorter ones on arthropods to cover today's content. So we were talking about annelids, segmented worms, and now we're going to talk about another group of segmented animals, but these segmented animals have segmented legs. And they get their name from the segmented legs. That's basically what arthropoda means. And this is the single most successful phyla of animals on the planet. That today is really the time of arthropods, not the time of mammals or birds. That the age of dinosaurs was really the age of arthropods. And before there were dinosaurs or vertebrates of any sort, there were arthropods ruling the seas. Arthropods are a hugely successful body plan in water, on land, in the air. And so we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the diversity, because 75% of all animals are arthropods. They include a lot of stuff you're familiar with. Spiders, mites, scorpions, millipedes, centipedes, on, including lots of marine things, including a lot of crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, and so on. Every arthropod has three basic body segments. Though I should be careful, in some cases we see some fusion and they can be hard to distinguish. But there's a head, and on this beetle you can see his head right here. And then you have a thorax, which is the middle region of the body. And it's actually to the thorax that all these legs attach and these wings attach. There's two pairs of wings. You can only see the hardened outer wings on the beetle. And then back here you have an abdomen underneath that set of wing covers. If you look at the arthropods, they tend to have a reduced body cavity, and in that body cavity they have not just coelomic fluid, but it's basically blood that's transported through an open circulatory system and fills the body cavity. Arthropods have exoskeletons, and see, these are hard chitinous structures with multiple layers. You've got outermost an epicuticle, which in terrestrial stuff is really important in terms of preventing water loss. Beneath it, you've got a procuticle, you've got a living set of epidermal cells down here in a basal membrane. This structure here is actually a gland that secretes waxy stuff. You'll have other cells with projections that lead up to sensory hairs. And when they create this exoskeleton, they create it simultaneously over the entire body. And then they also molt it simultaneously. They shed their skin, or I should say they shed their exoskeleton. And so there are challenges being locked inside this armor. To some degree you might think it's great to be protected by a thick layer of hard material. The downside is you lose mobility. And so arthropods, with those jointed legs that help them move around, need to have flexible joints. And the way they accomplish this is actually fairly complex. The joints need structural support. And so in a joint, you'll see some things that look like ball and socket joints, kind of like your shoulder, that bear the weight of the organism or help bear other forms of loads. But in order to move, you need elastic portions of the exoskeleton, and that's what this shows here. And sometimes this is called insect rubber. It's reslin. It's a really special material that's stretchy. And so it isn't rigid like the tubes of the legs here. It, in fact, can squash down if this thing folds in this direction, or it can expand if it folds this way. And wherever you have a moving joint, you'll have thin layers of reslin to help enable that movement. Note that everything is ultimately protected by the exoskeleton. And that's because if you had areas that weren't protected by the exoskeleton, and that includes this thin layer of reslin, you would lose moisture. And for terrestrial arthropods, losing moisture is really dangerous. They're small organisms, they don't have a big volume, and so they can't afford to lose water through evaporation from their skin surface. if you look at all the arthropods, when they grow, the size increase that they experience is discontinuous. They grow in a series of steps, and each step is associated with ecdysis, which is a fancy name for molting or shedding their exoskeleton. Ecdysis is under hormonal control, so they have a hormone called ecdysone, which controls this. They have an endocrine system, much the way vertebrates do, where they have different glands associated with that. For example, the X organ is a special gland associated with molting. There's the antenna gland, and so on. So if you look at size increases, this grasshopper is dropping its old exoskeleton. It's coming out, it's swelling up, it's puffing up its body with air and moisture, and then it will solidify this exoskeleton at a new, larger body size. If you look at the actual biomass of the animal, it's not growing in this discontinuous fashion. Basically, the biomass of the animal that was smaller compared to the animal that comes out of the molt is actually a little less because he's lost that. And by that I mean the dry weight biomass, because he's often added a little more water. But you have a continuous increase in biomass as this abdomen will swell, as it stretches here, and as water is excluded and air pockets are removed. And so the biomass is increasing in a continuous fashion, even though the size is increasing in a very discontinuous, stepwise fashion. Arthropods are really interesting in terms of muscular contractions. If you look at your nervous system, when you have a muscular contraction, your body basically sends nerve impulses and your muscle undergoes an all or nothing contraction. And by that I mean a motor unit of your muscle. And so you can generate a little bit of upward motion. So for example, if you pull up with your biceps, you can do it gently or hard. And what you're doing is not telling that whole muscle to either work gently or more rigorously, more forcefully. What you're doing is you're telling, for gentle pressure, small motor units, small numbers of muscles to contract, or I should say small numbers of muscle cells. And then when you get that big forceful contraction, what you do is you have lots of motor units with huge numbers of muscle cells all contracting. But muscle cell contraction in vertebrates is all or nothing. And it works really differently in the arthropods. There, when they contract a muscle, basically the strength of contraction depends on the rate of nerve impulses. Faster nerve impulses, stronger contraction. So the whole muscle is contracting even for gentle things, but it doesn't contract very forcefully because the neuron is basically telling it to, through a slow rate of firing, to not contract hard. And so what you see here is that a neuron basically, through its axon, splits up, and more than one neuron innervates, attaches to each muscle fiber, and each muscle fiber has a lot of different neurons going to it. Each neuron goes to a lot of different muscle fibers, and so this whole muscle can contract. These muscles aren't smooth muscles. They're striated, which means they can contract really rapidly. And part of the secret of arthropod success is rapid contraction, which allows them to move quickly, to fly, and to do a bunch of things that take really fast motion.